Today, make no mistake, block mania will literally kill innocent Australians. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And today I'm joined by a very worked up John Adams. Hello John, good to see you again.
Hello sir.
Now you watched the block.
I watched the block last night, so tonight is Monday night, Sunday night was the block finale. I was in the study, my wife says come and have a look at the finale, so I did. And my jaw dropped watching the finale, watching these auctions, and I just couldn't believe how much money was flying around in terms of these bids. But then when you look at the production value of what the Channel 9 had put together, I just walked away thinking that they've given the Australian people a very false impression as to what the market is looking like, what the economy is looking like. And there's going to be a lot of people, probably about 2 million people watched that show last night, and they're going to walk away with a particular impression. And that impression is going to lead to certain expectations, certain types of economic behaviour. And that, I think, is not only morally irresponsible for putting that sort of propaganda on national TV, but I think it's going to have horrific implications economically and socially across the country.
Yeah, but it's only TV, it's not real life, John. It's just there for effect.
So that's where you probably are wrong. I mean, obviously, because there was real property, real buyers, it was a legal auction. It's not just fiction, it is non-fiction, it's reality TV. And we've seen The Block, we've seen a whole bunch of these shows going over the last at least 10 years that have done these renovation shows. And there are people who watch these shows and they basically say, well, if they can generate $500,000 profit buying a place, really doing it up and then selling it, why can't I? Seek financial independence, seek their fortunes. And this is why, not only of all the public policy issues that we've talked about, from low interest rates to tax policy to banking policy with APRA, etc., it is the psychological warfare that has been bombarding the Australian people for 20 years about property that has led to this massive bubble, both in property prices but also in terms of household debt.
Psychological welfare, that's a pretty strong term. You sure it isn't just commercial reality, because there are lots of sponsors getting advert slots, there are, brand awareness, so it's actually generating a whole bunch of revenue for Channel 9, right?
That's right, yes.
Right. But you're saying it's psychological warfare?
Well, yes. So we're going to talk about a term late in the program about this term called ideological subversion. So this is a psychological technique that the KGB implemented when the Soviet Union was up and running. And we're going to hear from an expert who talks about this, explains it. And when you look at what all of these vested interest groups have been doing in Australia, it is the same sort of psychological technique.
Okay, so we are being sold a pup, basically, is what you're telling me?
100%.
Okay.
100%. And the more dangerous thing is a lot of people have bought into the illusion, and now psychologically they are trapped in that illusion, and no matter what new empirical data you put in front of them about how the economy is not healthy, some of these people just will not accept that the fantasy they've been led to believe through all of these different mechanisms is just a fantasy and it's not reality.
Right, so look at the production values, right? Great music, very flashy people, the whole thing, right?
Yes, we had 5 auctions last night and you had very attractive people, very well dressed. Everyone looks fantastic, everyone looks rich. The couple that won made over $545,000. So everyone walked away with a lot of money. There was one year where I think the first 2 couples made a lot of money, and then everyone else actually couldn't get over reserve. The expectations for those couples really got smashed, and Channel 9 took a lot of heat from the public to say, hey, why is it that only 2 couples made a lot of money and everyone else missed out? So they've got to obviously make sure that everyone walks away because they're selling a good news story. Here's all these people who slog their guts out for 3 months on this property. It looks fantastic. They want to make money, all of this sort of stuff. Now, at the beginning of the program, they did have a property consultant who did talk about the falling price in Melbourne. and they basically did warn that potentially their properties may not be sold. So they talked about the fall of price, they talked about the auction clearance rate in Melbourne, etc. So there was some pre-warning to the contestants that, this is a live market, this is real, and the market condition for Melbourne isn't that strong. So let's see how we go. But then when you looked at the actual, you look at these reserves, some of them start at 2.4 up to 2.7 million, and then the bidding starts. Once the bidding started to go, it's quite aggressive. Everyone's getting wrapped up, and then like you said, particularly on some of the auctions, you can, because I watched them again today, and you can actually see that there's dramatic music, softly in the background, and they really bring it up to the crescendo, the climax, and then they basically lock in the sale, and everyone's walking away happy, and so a whole bunch of people saying, well, if these guys can do it, why can't I do it? And obviously this is why you're getting a whole bunch of people, particularly millennials, I think, jumping hot into the market, and then basically saying, if they can do it, why can't we? And where I think we're going to see potentially some more risk here is that even if you're in the capital city markets where you're getting prices drop, well, certain people, because at the peak, certain people were priced out of the market. They're just saying, I can't afford to. Even though we've had the Royal Commission, we've had a slowing of credit availability and credit growth. If prices are coming down, that's going to invite a whole bunch of people who have been sitting on the sidelines to be able to then jump in.
Well, it's worth saying my surveys are showing some of this, right? So there are people who've said, wow, prices have dropped. I can now potentially access the market where I couldn't previously.
Yeah.
So I may well consider transacting, right? Small proportion of the total market. A lot of other people are saying, no, I'm not going to touch it for the while, particularly investors. But you're right, there are some people who are being lured in. And I suppose you could also argue that the property spruikers will say, well, there's nothing better than a really good auction, a really successful auction, to disprove all of this rubbish about prices falling, right? See, people can still make money, so therefore everything's fine.
Indeed. And you saw an article on news.com this morning where they talked about the block episode, and they said that the penthouses, so there was one buyer who bought the two penthouses, and apparently his budget was $3 million per penthouse, and he got them under $3 million, and he said this is a bargain. And I'm thinking, well, I mean, look, with all of this money sloshing around, and they're saying that these high prices is a bargain, I just could not believe in terms of what I was seeing. So in terms of the title of the episode, make no mistake, block mania will literally kill innocent Australians. Now, it's a provocative title to use for this sort of episode, but as we've spoken about in a previous episode about there was a study in the British Journal of Psychiatry, but also looking at what has happened in say Ireland or the US. So in financial crises, particularly where people are not psychologically prepared for an economic shock, suicide does skyrocket. People will kill themselves if there is a big economic crisis and they are overextended, or they're psychologically not prepared, or if their partner walks out of them, they lose the kids. I mean, again, massive social costs happening.
As a result, dole queues are now lengthening all over Ireland. And as the crisis deepens, charities are hearing from more and more desperate people.
We have people phoning up who are on the brink of ending their lives because they see no hope. The house is going to be repossessed, their car is being repossessed, they're losing their jobs, they've got serious financial worries. And there's tremendous marital strain and that great sense of failure. We've had some very prominent businessmen here in Ireland have died in recent months.
Suicide?
Yes, through suicide.
Because of the
economic climate, and especially those in the construction industry where their businesses have collapsed.
Now, we did a previous show about Ireland, and I've been looking more into the Irish situation after we've done the show with Sean Quinn. And the thing that I sort of found the other day, which was interesting, was that there was a particular Irish artist who was on a particular program, and they said that that during the Irish financial crisis, 2 families a day in Ireland became homeless. Ireland's population is about 4 million. We're about 25 million, so we're about 6 times more. So think of, rather than 2 families a day, think about 12 families a day in a financial crisis, where 12 Australian families could be homeless. Assume 4 people per family. We're talking about 48 people a day, being out on the streets. And when you think about that, what does that work out to be in about a month? First month of a crisis could be about 1,400 to 1,500 people homeless. And again, so there is a physical sort of dimension about having shelter, having food, being able to survive tough economic times, unemployment, all of this sort of stuff. But it's more the psychological impact of you've been sold a pup, you believe this fantasy, and then when those things just become shattered, a lot of people can't just handle the shock of the fantasy, the illusion sort of collapsing. So for me, suicide will go up, homelessness, emotional distress. These are real factors that could be that could affect a lot of Australians, and yet we still see a whole host of people out there in the community, from government to the banks to the property sector, the media, and these reality TV shows, basically selling an illusion. And a lot of Australians who don't have a strong understanding of the economics or the banking system are just being sucked into this vacuum of fantasy.
Ireland's boom made it the envy of the world. Its educated young people and low corporate tax rates made it a magnet for foreign companies. By 2006, it was property that sent the boom into the stratosphere.
It was an age in which entire nations succumbed to irrational exuberance. Hairdressers became celebrity hairdressers, builders drove Bentleys, people went on helicopters to the races.
It even spread to London. Irish property tycoons bought famous landmarks like the Battersea Power Station and the Savoy Hotel.
We were now being told we were one of the richest countries in the world, and we were thumbing our nose a little bit and laughing at the Brits, who were down the pecking order a little bit. We were now richer than they, and we deserved it.
Well, let me share something with you. I'm a philosopher by training, right? And one of the things that I did was a study of self-deception, right? Mm-hmm. And self-deception is basically where you partly know something, but you choose to ignore it and believe something else.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that that's what we're talking about here, right? So people may sort of peripherally know that maybe things aren't really quite as good as they want to believe, but they actually choose to believe that things will be fine, right? And anything like this just reinforces their sense that no, everything's fine, right?
Well, so I would agree that there are certain people like that, but just to give you a bit of a different flavour, someone who listens to the show on a regular basis, they contacted me on social media. We had a conversation last Friday. They work in Sydney, and they have gone to a few work colleagues and just asked them, what's your feeling about the economy? Are you ready for this economic crisis that's pretty obvious is coming? And these people just had no idea what this person was talking about. So it's clear to me that people listening to this show are living in a parallel universe to the rest of the population, because the rest of the population are completely asleep. They think everything's okay. Yes, we're going to see a bit of a small decline in house prices, but no systemic crisis, no systemic risk. And those are the people who are most vulnerable, because they're the ones holding the debt, and not only financially but psychologically completely unprepared.
Right. So basically Alice in Wonderland. The question is, who is living in Alice in Wonderland, right? Is it us or is it them?
All I can say is, based on economic history, based on the metrics, one can only conclude is that we're living in the real world, and the rest of the population is living in the fantasy. Now, the S-Lakes and the Kukulos and all of these people say, no, we're the fantasy people, but I think we'll be vindicated in a short amount of time.
Well, it's interesting. CoreLogic came out today with their expectation. Now they're now thinking prices will drop 15% peak to trough. So they've moved their score down a bit, right?
Yes.
So there are a few, but no, it's interesting, right? So there is definitely a couple of different schools here, right? There are those who think there's no issue, it's just a slight wobble, and those who actually think it's much more serious. Now, we happen to be in the much more serious camp because we've done the work, we've looked at the data, we've been following the trends for quite some time.
Yes.
Right. So, John, the question is, then what is below the surface here, right? What is really going on? Because it seems to me that it's more than just a few people being fooled by an auction site.
So as to understand what I think is happening psychologically with a lot of Australians, there is this concept called ideological subversion. So there was a Soviet defector, member of the KGB, who went to the US and then gave an interview in the early 80s and talked about what the KGB was really up to. So we think about the James Bond, we think about espionage, and this agent basically said that espionage was only a very small component of what the KGB was up to, but what they were really up to was to change the psychological perception, or to give a false picture to people in the West of what the world is really looking like, so that they can sort of shift their ideology, their mentality, and their values, and that was what they call psychological warfare or ideological subversion. So we've got a clip that we should listen to this agent talk about, and then we'll come back and sort of see how that's relevant for Australia.
Well, you spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets used the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. All you have to do, all American mass media has to do, is to unplug their bananas from their ears, open up their eyes, and they can see it. There is no mystery. There is nothing to do with espionage. I know that espionage intelligence gathering looks more romantic. It sells more deodorants through the advertising, probably. That's why your Hollywood producers are so crazy about James Bond type of thrillers. But in reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization.
Okay, so ideological subversion. Sounds pretty sinister, doesn't it?
What Yuri was saying in the clip was very pertinent to politics, to geopolitics vis-a-vis the Soviets and in terms of the Americans. Now, why I think ideological subversion is relevant to this conversation here in this Australian context is we've had at least, the last recession was 28 years. So particularly from the late 90s to now, so at least 20 years, we've had, in my view, a set of different interest groups selling a very consistent narrative, a very consistent worldview, and millions upon millions of Australians have bought into that reality to the extent that they have borrowed to the hilt. They've jacked up property prices to a very, very high level. And basically, just like what Yuri was saying, you present independent information, data-based, which is very consistent with the in terms of the DFA mission, and they will not listen to reality. So obviously, the more episodes we're doing, we're growing the DFA audience both here and around the world. So there is a growing number of people who are starting to wake up to reality, but there's still a whole bunch of people. And to be honest, I see it in my own social circle. I talk to them about these risks. I present them information. I said, "Are you aware of ABC?" The reaction I get is that looks interesting, but property prices will only fall a little bit. But then there'll be no systemic crash. Even though we know what the GFC, even though we know about Ireland, there are people who just cannot accept what we're saying until it smacks them in the face. I've drawn this diagram that, in my view, explains who are the interest groups in Australia that have been pushing the whole narrative of getting rich through property. Not only that, but downplaying the risks, either not mentioning the risks or anytime there is a raise of concern, either violently pushing back when you were, for example, on 60 Minutes, or coming up with false excuses, just like what happened in Ireland about immigration, about land supply, about regulation, all of this sort of stuff, as opposed to talk about the elephant in the room, which is about the supply of credit, the money supply, and the banking system. So when I look at ideological subversion in the Australian context, I look at the banks and the financial sector. And yes, they are providing loans, but they are also promoting, in their advertising, the dream of home ownership, financial independence. And obviously, you've got the property sector. I mean, they're basically saying the best investment possible is to chuck it into property. Shares are risky, bonds are risky, all of this, but property is as safe as gold. And anytime there's been a criticism about the risk in property, I mean, you hear a standard set of excuses, just like we said before around lack of supply or immigration or government regulation, but basically property is solid and there'll be no systemic crash. Then you've got, in terms of the media, the mainstream media, in my view, has been promoting a whole bunch of narratives around strong economy, low unemployment, the property sector and the construction sector is a vital part of the economy. We should be doing everything we can to keep it going, to keep it strong. But again, other than 60 Minutes that came out in the last couple of months, there hasn't been any sort of real critique about the state of the economy by the mainstream media, and to say, hang on, is this healthy? Is this not healthy? And then you've got, you've obviously got the government. So whether it was the Rudd-Gillard government or the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government, you've basically had no, there's this assumption in Canberra that, you cannot talk down the economy because that's going to impact confidence. If that impacts confidence, that's going to actually degrade economic growth. So the politicians have convinced themselves that they've got to keep on talking up the economy, can't talk about risks, can't talk about potential crashes or anything like that. So and that only not about the elected politicians, senior bureaucrats, Secretary of Treasury, RBA Governor, the head of APRA, everything's great. Fundamentals are sound. Get out there, have a go, borrow, consume, We've got to grow this economy, blah, blah, blah. And then you've got, these popular reality TV shows, whether it is The Block or, there's a whole host of them they've done either about property renovations or to buy and sell, auctioning, all of this sort of stuff. And then the last group, so this is where I am, and the universities teach a combination of macro Keynesian ideas plus a bit of neoliberalism with rational expectations and a whole bunch of theoretical models from the 70s that in reality have not proven to be correct. So no independent analysis about the state of the economy. There has been no real critique to say, well, are these debt levels sustainable? I mean, household debt before 2016 was hardly mentioned by the mainstream media. I mean, there was an article in January of 2016 by The Guardian. I come out with a big article in the telly in May, and then everyone started to say, oh, maybe we should talk about household debt. But before that, it was all about public sector debt. So it was like a non-virtual issue. And then people in the last little while have started to talk about it. So several years ago, when it came to some of these radio broadcasters, there was this scandal about cash for comment. They were saying things which were clearly not specific or explicit endorsements, but they were saying, "Oh, look, isn't this car great, or isn't that great?" And what it came out to be was they were paid to give these implicit endorsements. Well, I mean, for me, it's very important when you look at an economist speaking, who's paying that economist. If they are working for a bank, well, they can't talk about risk, because if they say the sky's going to fall in, there's going to be a run on the bank, and that's against the fiduciary duties of the bank employee. If they're being paid by the property sector, they have to be able to project a certain narrative. So some of the economists who have been very critical of you look at their sources of income, and I look at these economists as cash for comment. It's no different to some of these 2GB announcers that were caught in this scandal several years ago.
And it's worth thinking for this from one other perspective too, right? If you think about the GDP over the last 12 months, right, about 1.6% of it was actually from household consumption. That's around half, right?
Yeah.
And if you actually look at what's driving household consumption, then actually a lot of it's to do with property and indirectly expenditure around property.
That's right.
Right? So the fundamental economic drivers in the country, right, are we've got to let household consumption continue to grow, i.e. we've got to lend more to support the property sector to keep it to grow, because house prices grow, and that actually lifts our GDP number.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's the fundamental economic logic that I see, which is why the Reserve Bank and the Treasury are now saying, well, we mustn't let the Royal Commission throttle back credit too much, because that will actually squash the economy.
Yes. And what happens in bubbles is, bubbles from an economic point of view, it sucks in real economic resources. So we actually have, too many people working in the property sector, too many people working in construction trades, too many people in the finance sector. And once we get this economic Armageddon that I've been talking about, a whole host of people in those sectors will lose their jobs, and they will have to go into other sectors as the economy rebalances. But those people, if they're economically not prepared, they're going to be high in debt, no job. These reallocations of resources, they don't happen overnight, so they do take some time to work through the economy. And those people, just like an island, could be easily caught out, and they are very much likely to be caught out. So we've talked about ideological subversion. We've talked about how Australians, in my view, have been sucked into a fantasy that doesn't really exist. There are two clear case studies where the Australian people got sucked in to a false narrative, holus bolus by a big margin, and in both cases they were proven to be false. If it's happened in the early 80s, and the first case study is about the Lindy Chamberlain case. If it happened in around the 2005 with the Chappelle Corby case, I think we're seeing a repeat of millions of Australians being sucked into a fantasy or a fake state of knowledge. In terms of the Lindy Chamberlain case, so now I was 1 year old at the time, so I've got no recollection about it. But basically, a lady in Alice Springs loses her baby, says it was a dingo. There was a coroner inquest. The inquest found her not to be guilty of murder. The media really, the media, but also the Northern Territory Police basically said that the coroner was wrong. They really whipped up a frenzy around the country. A majority of Australians believed that she was guilty. And we have a clip from a movie that was done about that case. And why don't we play that clip?
A very dear friend of ours. And he's our saviour. And peace in God has kept us from being very foolish in our own lives.
In short, you're glad it's all over?
I didn't really think so.
Uncle, Pastor.
We have something here, gentlemen, you may like to see. This is a picture of Azaria, as she really was.
Look at that.
Proof to the world, as we said, a most beautiful baby.
Do you think it's necessary for you to go to this length?
No.
When was the photograph taken, Michael?
She was 6 weeks old.
2 weeks before she died.
Under report.
What was your reaction when you found
weird. She's as guilty as sin.
So yes, I mean, and that clip from that movie, I find that interesting because you've got the average Aussie in the pub just basically looking at Lindy Chamberlain and just saying she is guilty as sin. She definitely did it. The coroner completely got it wrong. Obviously, they found some new evidence. There was a professor who sort of found, apparently there's some additional forensic testing. They said, okay, we need to have a new court case. They had a court case and they found her guilty. So during the court case, people in the Northern Territory had shirts on saying the dingo is innocent. So they were marching up and down in front of the courthouse saying that Lindy Chamberlain is guilty. And the dingo is innocent. This dingo thing was completely a false facade, all of this. And then on the night, because the verdict came late one night, so when she was found guilty by the jury, there was wild cheers in front of the courthouse. They basically said, look, we got the bitch. She's guilty. Let's throw her in jail. And then obviously 3 years later, they found this missing jacket, which was the key piece of evidence. And then within a couple of days, she was released because they found that she was telling the truth all along. So this is a clear example of where, particularly in the case of what happened in the early 80s, people got sucked in because the media kept on causing doubt, and obviously there was some questions about her religious beliefs, her and her husband, but also the way she was behaving on camera. They just said it doesn't look like someone who's really grieving for their lost child, and everyone believed that she was guilty when she was really innocent. So the second case is what happened with Schapelle Corby. Now, the interesting thing with Schapelle Corby is so 1 week before the verdict in Bali, Channel 9 did a special about the case. They presented the evidence for the prosecution. They presented the case for Schapelle's defence. They had a live studio audience who had the worm. People could dial in to a hotline and basically ring one number for innocent, one number for guilty, and 91% said innocent, 9% said guilty. And to be honest, I was one of those people who thought she was innocent. So I got completely sucked in. I still remember, when the verdict was given on TV, I was watching it live. And when the jury said she's guilty, 20 years in jail, I got very upset. I got very emotional, and I thought this is a travesty of justice. What are the Indonesians doing to our citizens? Blah blah blah. But me and a whole bunch of other people got just sucked into what the media had really whipped up in terms of this positive story. And it was only until later where the full context of the Corby family and their associations with narcotics was revealed. There was a poll done in 2014 by UMR Research, and in 2014 only 19% believed only a few years ago that she was innocent. So from 91% to 19%, and it was all because that before the verdict, not all the information was presented to the Australian people, and then once, with reflection, and then with all the information coming in about the family's history, it went from 91 to 19%. So these are two classic case studies where the Australian people have been sucked into a false story, and then it was proven to be false. And I think we're seeing this phenomena a third time with the economic bubble. But this is much more significant because the propaganda has been 20 years in the making. It's been not just one source of information, i.e. the media, but it is the media, it is the government, it's TV shows, it's the banks, it's the real estate industry. It is a network of integrated psychological warfare. Millions have bought into this. Millions won't accept anything other than what they have been led to believe. And they are making economic decisions based on this fantasy. And I think that there will be significant hardship coming, social hardship for those people who believe in this worldview that doesn't stack up to the worldview that you and I have.
Look, John, I've been sitting here listening to you, right?
Yeah.
And you know, I'll be honest with you, I don't get taken in by the block and what have you. So my obvious question is, why are people so gullible? What is it that drives them to sort of grab onto these, you know, things that really aren't real?
So probably I would have a twofold answer. I think there are a lot of people who are gullible, who don't think independently, who whatever they are presented with, they would just accept on face value, and they are prone to making stupid mistakes. So whether you want to call them unsophisticated economic agents or the vulnerable, or whatever the case may be, there is clearly a gullible set of people. But beyond those gullible people, there's a whole bunch of smart, intelligent, rational people who I think are caught in the fantasy because you've had multiple sources of people reinforcing a consistent message, and there is no alternative voice. There is no one saying, "Hey, is this risky?" or maybe you shouldn't be, or maybe you should have a different understanding of economics or the banking system. So when I'm a bit of a history buff, when I've looked at world history, there are times where humans can be caught up in a mania, and there are times where governments, dictatorships, whether it was Germany during the Nazi period or others, where you have one voice that's telling the population one thing, and that one message is reinforced over and over again, and people just tend to believe it, and there is no counter view being expressed, and with no counter view, people just are driven to all sorts of beliefs that they will become rich off something, or they will hate a particular group because they are told to hate that particular group. So integrated reinforced propaganda is very powerful. And to be honest, in my younger years, I would have fallen for. Not only would I have fallen, I did fall for a whole range of mainstream media narratives. Whereas now, if the Sydney Morning Herald tomorrow on the front page said the sky is blue, well, I won't actually accept that on face value. I will say, okay, that's an interesting piece of information. Let me think about that. Let me investigate it further before I will accept what's on the front page of a newspaper.
And let me tell you a little story from my philosophical background, right? Thomas Kuhn wrote about scientific revolutions, right? And he looks in detail at why it was that the scientific establishment would stick to a particular theory of how things worked. And everybody would seem to have the same opinion, right? Yeah. And there'd be no dissenting voice. And then, despite new evidence coming in, right, the predominant view will still be maintained, and those people on the edge will effectively not get a hearing or will be laughed out of court.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, it flips, and those ideas that were effectively, on the peripheral and seen as being stupid suddenly become the new mainstream idea. And it's all about the point at which there's a tipping point, right? When suddenly the true evidence is brought to bear to show that actually the theory doesn't work, right?
Yes.
But it's about the psychology of people.
Yes.
And it's about the weight of numbers and the force of the crowd. Right?
Indeed.
And I think it's exactly the same thing that you've been talking about, right? That effectively, if there is a consistent set of themes and messages being, transmitted all the time, people just buy it.
Yep.
Right? And anybody who stands out against that is just seen as odd.
Indeed.
But if you look over time, often those people who are seen a bit odd ultimately are proved to be the guys who actually knew what was going on.
Absolutely.
And hopefully that's us.
Yes. So I'm fairly confident. Like at the end of the day, it is going to be us. But the horrific thing from a societal point of view is that those people who won't believe until they see it with their own eyes, by the time they see it, it's too late for them to do anything economically about it.
As Douglas Adams, I think, put it, reality is on the blink again.
Yes.
John, thank you very much.
No problems.
So there you have it. The question is, which is the real reality? I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching. If you liked the post, please do share it and add a comment. We read them all. And check back again next time.